Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by a legendary writer. I think I'm confident in saying, Kier-La Janisse. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You are the author of numerous books, and you have also gone into podcasting yourself. You're also now into film distribution. Yeah, you've got fingers in many pies.
No, it's true. I've edited a lot of books. I think like my career started in film programming, and so a lot of it was about sharing films with other people. And then that just ended up expanding to other ways that you share films with people, so I started publishing and writing books about film, working with film distribution companies, and then eventually starting my own distribution branch of my company. And I still put on screenings and stuff, so it's really all about getting, sharing your enthusiasm for certain films with other people and sort of justifying why you like those films so much or whatever. But it all kind of comes from the same place.
Let's talk about the place that it comes from and the time that it comes from. What was your first sort of experience with film, and what sort of lit that fire that made it something special?
Well, I was a horror film fan from birth. Pretty much. My earliest memories are watching horror films. And my parents, they also liked horror films. They were not as obsessive about them as me, and they liked different kinds of horror films. But they encouraged me, because I had a really strong interest compared to like my brother, for instance. It took him like 40 years to find something that he was really passionate about. But for me, it was obvious right out of the gate that I loved horror films. I loved ghosts. I loved monsters. And so they would buy me books, so we would either go to flea markets and my dad would buy me, if we saw like a vampire book or whatever, So like David Pyre's vampire book that he had made was an early book that I had, There was all kinds of picture books that I don't even remember exactly what they were, but they were just full of pictures from horror films, and I hadn't seen many of the films. So I just had all these pictures. And in some cases, it took me a while till I got older, till I could kind of piece together what those films were and see them. But yeah, it was just something that was in my life from a really young age, was films and books about films, because a lot of times that was how I would hear about films or first encounter them, was because I saw them in a book somehow.
Isn't that strange? Isn't that such a weird sort of... I think it's because it sort of strikes your imagination. You're imagining the film. You're imagining a work of imagination. So it's sort of like you're more interactive, really.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting because, how you say on your tagline of your podcast is basically that it's the only podcast devoted to writers on film. And that is one of the things that's so interesting, is that when you are a writer about film, it's so hard to categorize what you do to other people. And there's so little recognition of people who do that, because it's like, I am not a film critic, and I'm not a film historian by any official sense, like any actual historian would tell you I'm not a historian because I don't have the academic background to really be called that. And so writing books about film that kind of exist in this place where you're a fan, you're coming to these things as a fan, and you're sort of building up this independent scholarship around something. It is this kind of thing that falls through the cracks a lot, And I imagine there's probably lots of people you interview on your show who are kind of like that, who kind of fall through the cracks of like recognition or whatever for like what they do.
Yeah, I feel that there is a sort of unspoken prejudice that, oh, you write a book about a film. Well, why don't I just watch the film? Why do I have to read about it? Why it's homework or something I have to do. But I've always felt like it's like cigarettes and coffee. They go to either one is good, but put them both together, and all of a sudden, you're David Lynch.
Yeah.
Not that I'm
Yeah.
encouraging anybody to smoke, obviously. I smoked for years, it was a terrible habit, and now I've stopped. But I do recall it being kind of good sometimes. The idea of horror as well, specifically, is really interesting to me. I was a horror fan from a very early age, watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre when I was way too young, Evil Dead Ditto. What is it? Because I mean, I'm really scared of horror movies. I'm not one of those people who sits through them sort of like a jaded, that kill isn't as good as this kill or something like that. They affect me viscerally, but I still come back to them. What is it? Are we sado? Are we masochists? Is that it?
Well, I think there's different kinds of horror films, and there's different horror films that serve different purposes for people, like so people who like slasher films and stuff and often are really interested in the effects and the sort of technical wizardry of the kills and stuff like that. But for me, from a young age, it was always ghosts and monsters, so it
Mm.
was like ghosts are still my favorite, ghost stories. Um, and so a lot of that, it's like this sort of stereotype of like the monster kid is that the kid relates to the monster. The kid relates to this outcast character and in some ways starts to sympathize with those characters and question whether they're really as bad as people say they are and stuff, So there's definitely something of that in the monster movie for me as a kid. Also, I had monster books, I had a Hallmark book called Lamont the Lonely Monster that was very sympathetic to this monster that appeared dangerous and scary from the outside, but he was really this nice monster that wanted a friend and stuff. So, I mean, even as a little kid, having like children's books and stuff I had um, would personalize the monsters in this way. And then but ghosts were something totally different because to me, ghosts still remain the scariest thing because they're related to the idea that we don't know what happens after death. And when you're a kid and you start to have maybe the first people in your family die, like a grandparent that dies or something like that, or somebody's your friend's mom or something. The idea of ghosts just starts to become really fascinating, because they are not just a scary thing, they're also potentially someone that you love, that has come back and is looking for something or who is just there to look out for you. So there's a lot of ambivalent feelings that people have about ghosts, like they're afraid of them, but in some ways they also feel like, well, maybe ghosts are good. Maybe ghosts are like our loved ones that have come back and are looking over us. Um, and those kinds of tensions where you have like ambivalent feelings about something, that's something where horror works really well. It really likes to play with those tensions. Um, and so, yeah, so that was something I was interested in even from a young age. But when you talk about Texas Chainsaw, for instance, I knew from a young age, I think it may also have been Texas Chainsaw that I saw really young. And I was like, I told my mom, I'm not ready to see a film like that. So
Mm.
I censored myself as a kid. My
Mm.
parents didn't really, I mean, they censored me from sex. So I was not allowed to see sex movies. But in terms of horror and violence, they didn't really care. I was allowed to sort of censor myself. And so I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that a human being would kill another human being. So that kind of horror, I was like, I can't deal with this because I don't know what's happening.
Mm.
Like, so the idea of humans killing, like the idea of a monster or a ghost is something different from
Mm.
humans killing each other. And so that was something I was like, I told my mom, I'll watch movies like this when I'm 12. So
Very
I was like,
sensible.
when I'm 12, I'll be ready to watch Friday the 13th. Um, Yeah, so a lot of slasher films I didn't start watching till I was 12 or 13 when I thought I was older. And then, of course, I became like a teenage gore hound. So all through my teenage years, it was all about gore, all about more, more, more. Like whatever is the most like extravagant gore scenes, was the stuff that I loved. And I'm very different. Now I'm much more back how I was as a kid, where I'm very ghost focused. But also, I was a horror fan for so long. For so long, I was only a horror fan.
Mm.
Like I wouldn't watch anything except horror until I was in my mid 20s.
Mm.
So it was really my mid 20s when I would watch stuff that was considered cult if it had some darker edge to it, so stuff that wouldn't be considered horror, but that would be considered sort of darker cult films. Like something like Santa Sangre, like Alejandro Jodorowsky, when that came out, stuff like that. But then, yeah, it was really, I remember in my mid 20s having a friend who was really into like Italian crime films and Italian westerns and stuff. And I was like, well, I don't like those things because they're not horror. And he was just like, well, you're an idiot because it's all the same people making those movies. He's like, if you love Italian horror movies, you will also love these movies because it's literally the same people making all those movies because they just switch from one Filone to the next. Um, so eventually I realized, of course, that he was right, and I got like obsessed with Italian crime films for a while. And so that sort of branched things out a lot. And so a lot of the projects I work on now are not even necessarily horror. I do a lot of books about film that are not horror. And also like I'm really obsessed with this sort of fantasy idea of childhood that I had when I was
Mm.
younger. So I've done a lot of kid related things. I edited a book called Kid Power, for which I interviewed John Huff about his like Escape to Witch Mountain and uh, Watcher in the Woods. Did he make Watcher in the Woods? He did make Watcher in the Woods.
Yeah, that sounds
Um,
familiar. Yeah.
and that was a fascinating interview because there's actually a lot of scholars now who are working in the idea of children's horror. But back when I first did this book, I mean, it wasn't even that long ago. It was like 2014, but I couldn't give these things away. Nobody wanted
Mm.
this book, Kid Power, because people like kids movies. Who cares about that? And but I was like, but there's a lot of great stuff in it. But I had done this interview with John Huff, like specifically about the dark side of Disney, like what happened when all these like Disney started making all these weird horror movies for kids, like that whole period, because
Yeah.
he made two of the big ones. And so he was able to talk about a lot of that, but like, nobody looks at that book or cares about it. It was kind of like a couple years too early before people started caring more about those things again. Like the Scarred for Life books, and um, there's another scholar named Catherine something. I cannot remember what her last name is, but she's like a kids horror scholar. And I used to run a school called the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies. It's still going, but I don't run it anymore. I
Right.
started it in 2010, and I ran it for 10 or 11 years before I passed it off. But this scholar I gave her one of her first classes where she got to like she hadn't graduated from university yet. So she
Right.
came and did kind of a test of her thesis or whatever at Miskatonic. Um, and now she's considered like an authority in this genre. But so there, but anyway, so that was like another interest of mine, and my podcast that I do very rarely is focused on that. It's focused on kids films. Um, so yeah, and I also do a lot of music film stuff too. I do a
Mm.
lot of music crossover, counterculture music film. So yeah, it's all kinds of stuff, but horror was where it all started.
I watched a musical recently, the first film by Lina Wertmuller. You were talking about Italian film earlier, and her first film was called Rita la Zanzara, Rita the Mosquito, and it's like Saint Trinian's in Naples with this like mischievous little Pippi Longstockings kind of schoolgirl who's breaking all the rules and everything, and it's
Huh,
full of cracking Italian pop, and it's just
huh.
beautifully filmed. It's like sunsplash, beautifully filmed. Giancarlo Giannini, who is kind of her muse, he's in all her films, is in it as well. So I saw that at Bologna. It was wonderful discovery at that film festival. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you talking about kids horror because, of course, yeah, you have Something Wicked This Way Comes. Is that one of those dark Disney films that introduced me to Jonathan Pryce? I remember that was the first time I ever saw him as Mr. Dark. Great, wonderful stuff. Miskatonic, of course, a reference to H.P. Lovecraft, which is an entry portal for many a horror fan, I feel.
Yeah, and that was something. I had a friend in high school that was a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, and that was how, because I had read horror, but I'd read kind of like Stephen King and Peter Straub, and my mom read horror novels, so I would get the books after she read them and stuff. But H.P. Lovecraft was new to me when this high school friend mentioned him, and so I got like really obsessed with Lovecraft for a while as a teenager. And the reason my school ended up being called Miskatonic is because when I was in high school, I quit school a lot. I was kind of a juvenile delinquent. I quit school like 6 times, went to different schools. And the thing that made me graduate from high school was reading H.P. Lovecraft. And I was convinced, I was like, I loved the like scholarly lifestyle that he described. And I was like, well, to be like that, you have to go to university, you know, so I have to go to university if I want to be one of these guys. And not only that, but I thought Miskatonic University was a real place. So I was like, I'm going to graduate from high school and I'm going to go to Miskatonic University, and then I'm going to be one of these scholars. I'm going to like translate Latin texts or something. And then I remember graduating from high school and I was living in an apartment with a friend, and we had no phone because I lived independently from a young age and often had like no money, you know, so I had no phone. So there was a pay phone on the corner. And I remember going to the payphone and calling Massachusetts Directory Assistance. And I said, I want to be connected to Miskatonic University. And the lady is like, where is it? And I'm like, it's in Arkham, Massachusetts. And she's like, there is no Arkham, Massachusetts. And I'm like, of course there is, Miskatonic University. I mean, this is before the internet, right? So you had no way to know instantly that these things weren't real. And so I'm sitting there and my heart just sank. I was just like, I graduated for nothing. And so years, I was just so deflated. Like this woman just thought I was such an idiot, you know, because this place I'm trying to reach did not exist. And so then years later, I had the opportunity to do a workshop for teenagers, like a film workshop. And I decided to call it the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies as a, yeah, it was like as a tribute to that idea that it could be real. But then that course ended up kind of taking off and branching off into an actual thing, you know. So when I first did it, it was just supposed to be a one-off course for teenagers, and it ended up being an ongoing series, like a monthly series for adults, you know, because it was like more adults were interested in taking those courses. I started it off for teenagers, and I was always getting asked by adults, can I take the course? And I was like, well, it's not really made for adults. Like I don't have a PhD or anything, you know, like, I mean, I don't know that it would be helpful, or you probably already know everything, you know. But adults really wanted to take the courses, so we ended up rejigging the school to be more kind of like undergraduate level horror. So yeah, and that still goes. So there's still a branch in London. It is run by Josh Sacco, who's a former film programmer. He may still be a film programmer.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it's like Field of Dreams, you know. You have to build it, and then they will come. You know, we need to found the town of Arkham next. That's your next job. Let's make that a real thing.
Yeah, except that now Lovecraft is, you know, he's racist, and they're taking his name off everything and stuff. So in hindsight, I was like, maybe it shouldn't have been named after an H.P. Lovecraft thing.
Yeah, I know.
But anyways, I associate it more with my story. You know, the fact that it's named Miskatonic has more to do with me and my story than it does actually to do with him. So
yeah, unfortunately, there were a lot of racists back then, so I think there's quite a few writers who won't pass that test if we
Yeah.
if we're going to go down that route. I don't know if 1977-year-old me would pass that test. So we'll
Yeah.
you know. Let's allow
Yeah.
some room for evolution and mistakes. I'm really interested in this idea of ghosts as well that you're talking about, because I think there's a real popularity that horror has won. Essentially, many horror films every year have commercial successes. We're just watching Backrooms recently. We've watched Sinners last year, Obsession this year as well. It seems to be that that they're both on the independent level and on the sort of big budget level. Horror has never been in a better place. But I do wonder if ghosts are the one area which don't get as much of a sort of trend, or as a, do you know what I mean? We have a whole swathe of zombie movies, or we have a whole swathe of vampire movies, but ghost movies don't seem to, they seem less trendable, if that's a thing.
I don't know. Because I feel like I watch a lot of ghost movies, so
Maybe, yeah, maybe you
and
just
but
need to.
also ghost movies tend to be they tend to be intimate movies too, right? So they're
Mm,
not generally big spectacle movies. They often don't have the potential to be big spectacle movies, because they are often, they often take place in a domestic space, like a
mm,
confined domestic space, and there is often, again, that ambiguity about whether the main character is undergoing some sort of psychological break of some sort, and whether the ghost is even there at all, so whether it is a ghost movie or whether it's actually a psychological horror movie, so I feel like in some ways they don't have the same. You look at movies like Poltergeist, that movie is certainly a spectacle. I don't want to say like ghost movies don't have the same potential to be spectacle movies, but I do think that a lot of the ghost movies I see are quiet movies.
yeah,
They're like
yeah.
quiet, personal movies.
Just as I was saying that, I suddenly sort of corrected myself by thinking, oh, wait a minute, Steven Soderbergh's last movie, Presence, was a ghost movie. And
Yeah,
and
but
and,
again,
and
it's like a very intimate film.
absolutely, 100%, 100%. Okay, so sort of one of your landmark achievements, if you like, one of the milestones of your career is the House of Psychotic Women, which we sort of emailed about as well, and you were like, "Oh, that's ages ago." So, but let's just talk about that for a
Yeah, I think I
moment.
said that's a moldy oldie. Yeah,
Exactly. It's a Necronomicon, isn't it? That book.
yeah.
How did that come about, and how did that sort of? Because also, I'm reading your Monty. I keep calling it your Monty Hellman book. Your book on Cockfighter, the wonderful Monty Hellman film. You actually said in that book how when you were promoting the House of Psychotic Women, you didn't write it as a feminist, but you sort of, almost as you were promoting it, you went more in the direction. It was like received as a feminist book, but it hadn't been written in that way. But by the time you'd finished promoting it, you were feeling more like you were aligned with feminism than not. Is that accurate? I want to be.
Not exactly. I would say it was definitely a feminist book, and it was,
Mm,
I'm definitely a feminist, and I was at the
mm,
time that I was writing the book. But I knew that the book had a lot of things in it that were problematic for being a
right.
feminist, right? And so that was the thing I was surprised by, was more that the existing world of feminist writers and speakers and educators and stuff, that they would accept it as a feminist book. That was kind of the thing that surprised me more, was that I would get invited to be a speaker at things, and I was kind of surprised because I felt like there's a lot of stuff in this book that's problematic if you're a feminist. I mean, it's so driven male perspective, many of these films, the psychology that I use, because again, I'm not a psychologist, right? So in a lot of horror, when horror delves into psychology, often it's delving into the simplest and most known tropes of psychology. So it is dealing with Freud, who is like old hat now, but a lot of horror films, when they use psychology, that is the psychology they're kind of using. And so I knew that that was problematic, that that was not that this was a misogynistic brand of psychology, that I'm reading films through and stuff. But I also knew that that was inherent to the films themselves. So there was just all this stuff in the book that I thought I was surprised that feminists would recognize it as a feminist book, because I had read this earlier film book, which I reference, I think, in House of Psychotic Women, called Recreational Terror, which I think was written by Isabel Cristina Pinedo. And in that book, she talks about how being a horror fan, she was always deflecting criticism. She's always having to defend her love of these movies to other women. And so I sort of felt like my book would be received that way, and it wasn't. So I was just really surprised by it. But also, my books, I've only written 3 books as a sole author, and those books were my first book, which is all about the Italian actor Luciano Rossi, and then House of Psychotic Women, and then my Cockfighter book. So actually, 2 of my 3 books are hyper masculine books. Because Luciano Rossi was a character actor who was in Italian crime films, Italian westerns, giallo films, and it's very focused on masculinity and masculine styles of directing and stuff like this. And Cockfighter, of course, is hyper masculine, the world that it takes place in. And so House of Psychotic Women is the thing I'm most known for, but it's kind of flanked by these other projects I've done that are much more, that are just not dealing with feminism is a word that doesn't even exist in the worlds of these other 2 projects. So that was just an interesting experience to me, how that book was received. Because I didn't even expect anyone to read it. When I first wrote House of Psychotic Women, I proposed it to a friend of mine who was a publisher. So Fab Press, the only reason he ended up publishing the book was because I knew him from film festivals. He was always at film festivals that I went because he had a table selling books. So we became friends. And I actually came up with the title of the book first. I said, I want to write a book called House of Psychotic Women. And he was like, great, I'll publish that. Without the book even existing. He just was like, that's a good title, I'll publish that. And then when I actually wrote the book and submitted it, I was worried that he would not publish it because it was so personal. It was like, I write in the first person.
Right.
I tell all kinds of stories from my life and my childhood and my relationships and my family and everything mixed in with the film analysis. And at that time, that was really unusual. Like, somebody else told me somebody told me that James Baldwin wrote a book like that, which I have not seen and have not read. So I don't know how accurate that comparison is, but I had not seen another book before mine that had been written like that. And so I was really worried that it was going to just be rejected, right? Like where he was going to be like, I can't sell this to horror fans that, like I thought they would laugh at me. Like I thought that the horror fans, especially like male horror fans, were going to just make fun of the book, because it was so personal. I thought they were going to be like, oh, wow, your sad life or whatever. And the response ended up being like, my publisher read it and he was like, oh my God, I love this. This is so, he's like, it reads so fast. Like it's so easy to read. And he's like, this is better than I thought it was going to be. And I was like, really? And then when it came out, it had a good response, but it didn't have a big response. It took about 2 years, I think, for me to start seeing any sort of real, not only interest in the book, but I actually started to see, around the same time as I started to see some interest in the book, I also started to see the influence of the book. So the book was having influence within 2 years because there were filmmakers who were making films that told me they had been inspired by my book because they wanted to make a House of Psychotic Women film. That I kept hearing that over the years from about 2014 on, that or I'd go to film festivals and I'd be in the Q&A and the director would talk about my book in the Q&A and I was just like, oh, how weird, And so it wasn't necessarily me that the filmmakers were tapping into. It was the idea of this umbrella that I had made for certain types of films, and that these films that to me seem so obviously connected that I guess people hadn't thought of them all under this same umbrella before. So they were like, oh, I like movies like that too. I want to make a House of Psychotic Women film. And then I started to notice it in the worlds of writing, where magazines, horror magazines and stuff started to accept more personal writing like that. Because when I used to write for Fangoria, for instance, it was a no-no. You could not write in the first person. It was very much by the old sort of journalistic codes of like how you write an article, and that has totally changed. And I don't know that I don't think that's entirely because of my book. I think that's also due to blogging culture, because blogging culture was very personal, and a lot of bloggers made the transition into writing for film websites and stuff like that. So that style of writing from the first person or with episodes from your life kind of built into the article or whatever, it just started to become more normalized around that time. And so maybe instead of inventing that, my book actually benefited from that. So maybe it was something that kind of started with bloggers, and my book came out at a time when people were just finally ready to accept that type of approach to film writing. But yeah, so I mean, but I was also really reluctant to write the book from that perspective. And there was a couple other books that people always ask me what other books inspired that book. And they're very clear inspirations to me. One is Maitland McDonough's book about Dario Argento, Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, because that was, I mean, I go into the full plot synopsis in my book where I even talk about the ending. And I remember some people were very upset about how many spoilers there were in the book. And I was like, because I had read Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, I just thought that was normal because she does that. She does the full analysis of the film and she talks about the ending of every film, right? So I just thought that was allowed in a book. And then I was like, oh, people actually think I'm ruining the movies. So that was a direct influence on like, how do you write about a film, And then in terms of autobiography, the autobiographical elements, Stanley Booth wrote a book about the Rolling Stones called The True Adventures of the Rolling Stones. And that book is like, he's basically along with them on their tour when they're going to like Altamont and stuff like this, and like making Exile on Main Street and stuff. And he's supposed to be writing about about the band and documenting the band, but during the book he's like having a nervous breakdown. He's like, his girlfriend is breaking up with him, and like all these personal things are happening as part of the book. And I remember reading that sort of just separately from, but I thought of that when I was doing House of Psychotic Women, and that helped to give me some confidence about the idea of being personal, because I was like, well, that Stanley Booth book really works, and it's full of personal stories that have nothing to do with the Rolling Stones. They're about him and his life, so that was an influence too. But yeah, then it just became kind of its own thing.
I have seen the influence of the book definitely in a lot of film books that I've been reading, and I've interviewed some of the authors on this show. And I think it is that positive thing where people feel comfortable of saying, I mean, it's like what we were talking about earlier, I guess, of the idea of a scholarly approach to film. When most people, their reactions to a film might come down to something like, I was going through a period in my life when I saw this film and it spoke to this. And so sometimes putting that on the table can be really valuable and really insightful. Where do those insights come from? I do have a little caveat, which is, I think when I started writing film journalism and everything, I think I did the first 5 years for publications which were, like you said, were very strict about no first person, no subjective sort of openly subjective stuff, because obviously we're always subjective even if we disguise it. And I think it's really good to have that to begin with. It's, when you've done that discipline and then you start to use the first person, you appreciate the freedom of it and you value it and you are careful with it. I think that's always a good sort of foundation for the freedom, if you know what I mean. But I don't know, that's just what I think. I might be entirely wrong.
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel like you can kind of tell the difference, in some of the writing when you read personal writing by people who have gone through that more traditional style compared to people who are, I don't want to diminish people who are like purely self-taught and came up just with their own blog or whatever, but but there is kind of a difference that you can tell when people are used to having an editor or not, right?
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's the big
exactly.
thing is like when you write for articles, you have an editor, you have somebody that's vetting your writing all the time. And when you're a blogger, you don't have that experience, and you don't necessarily recognize how great it is to have an editor, like how nice it is
Absolutely.
to have somebody looking out for you, to being like, this sentence is a little cheesy. You might want to change this or whatever, Um, yeah, so I don't know. I actually love editors. I feel as though I don't get edited enough. I don't do enough. I do so much stuff. I also publish books, right? So I feel like I'm often the editor for other people, but I don't get edited enough. My Cockfighter book was a perfect example. So when I first thought of doing a book about Cockfighter, I actually pitched it to Midnight Marquee Press because they were looking for pitches. And I pitched Cockfighter and they were like, no, not interested.
Somebody should have said, great title. I'll do it on the title alone. Oh,
But
it's a film.
I think partially it's because I think the film's never been released in the UK,
Right.
so I think they were thinking maybe the film didn't have the reach,
Mm.
that the other titles in the series. So fair enough. But anyways, I don't know if I even asked any other publisher. I think I was so demoralized by that because I was like, at that point, I'd written House of Psychotic Women and everything, and I was like just surprised they wouldn't just say yes because it would be the next book by the author of House of Psychotic Women. So I was kind of deflated by that, and so then I just decided I was going to publish it through my own publishing company, Spectacular Optical. And the thing that sucked about that was that I started to get intense anxiety after I sent it to print that the book was actually terrible. And I was like, because there was no editor, there was nobody that was putting their money on the line with your project, and I didn't realize how much that counted as a vote of confidence, to have another publisher say, yes, I would pay money to publish this, I would pay money to manufacture this book. But the fact that I didn't have that person or that company or whatever started to make me feel a lot of doubt. So it was literally at the printer, and I had to contact one of my friends who's also he's an experimental filmmaker and also writes about film and stuff. I sent him the manuscript and I'm like, "Can you please tell me, am I about to ruin my career with this book? Is this book so terrible?" But I was literally about to pull that book off the press because I started to feel like not having an outside editor for the book, that I was too close to it and I couldn't tell if it was good or not. Um, and luckily, my friend read it and said, "No, I think you're wrong. I think this book is actually really interesting." And then the few people who've read it, because hardly anyone has read it, it's very weird because I kind of knew that would happen. I mean, my
Mm.
Luciano Rossi book was the same. Now people know who Luciano Rossi is a bit more. At the time, it was like 2005 or 2007 when that book came out. Like, no one had a clue who that guy was. It's like nobody bought that book. It went straight into the remainders. And then my Cockfighter book, I felt like it was going to be kind of the same where, if people don't like the movie Cockfighter or if they haven't seen the movie Cockfighter, they're not going to buy this book. And, but I actually like it the best. I like it better. I think it's a better book than House of Psychotic Women. Because
Wow.
I'm probably a better writer now, but also it was a different type of project because it was much more archival,
Mm.
so House of Psychotic Women was just me and my opinions. And the Cockfighter book was like, I went into Charles Wilford's archive, I went into his papers, I was listening to your podcast actually when you were talking to the guy who made the book about Don't Look Now, which I have and I love,
Wonderful book.
which you are also in because you do the interview with Pino
Uh,
Donaggio
That's right, yeah.
in that book.
And he's just done the music to Nicholas Winding Refn's new film, Her Private Hell.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Or Her Private Nightmare
But
or
yeah, I
Her
was,
Private Hell.
but
Yeah.
Her
Sorry.
Private Hell, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, but that kind of project where you get to go into people's archives and you get to get these rare photos and these like rare blueprints for things. And in the case of Charles Wilford, it ended up being very Charles Wilford focused just because there was an archive. Monty Hellman did not have an archive. When I was working on the book, Monty Hellman and Roger Corman were still alive, so I had interviews with them. But I didn't have a lot of cooperation from Monty Hellman, surprised. He just didn't like the movie. If I was making a book about Two-Lane Blacktop, there already was a book about Two-Lane Blacktop, so I need to make a book about that. But I feel like he would have been much more forthcoming with materials or whatever, but he was really just brushed off the book a lot, Whereas on the side of Charles Wilford, he not only had an archive where I was able to find evidence of this character existing in earlier forms, like in earlier short stories or fragments of short stories he'd written that he hadn't published. I was able to get permission from his widow, who was amazing. Like, she was so great through the whole project. She gave me permission to reprint like all these letters, like all the letters from Roger Corman to Charles Wilford as they're sort of negotiating the contract for the movie rights and stuff like that. So I got access to a lot of materials on the Charles Wilford side. And so that was really interesting, including, like, in the book Cockfighter, there's a whole section of the book that's not in the movie. There's like a subplot where the character is also a musician and he plays guitar. And so there's all these scenes where he's playing guitar to try to raise money because he's lost all his money cockfighting and he's trying to get back into it. Charles Wilford's stepson had written songs for the character. And so in the archive was also this cassette tape that had these home recorded songs that Charles Wilford's stepson had just been, his imagination had just been kind of ignited by reading the book, and he wrote songs the character could play. And then I found letters where Charles Wilford is kind of pitching these songs to Roger Corman, saying, like, maybe you can use these in the movie. And they never did, but I have those recordings, so and then in the end, like, Charles Wilford also wrote a set diary. So he has a set diary called Cockfighter Journal that was printed in a limited edition. And he says a lot of stuff in that book, which I was then able to use as a foundation when I interviewed other people to sort of double check some of the details of what he said. And one of the things I was really anxious to find out was he mentioned how Ed Begley Jr. came onto the set and he had just come from a crime scene in his backyard, that he arrived on the set after a mutilated body had just been found in his garbage in his yard.
Oh my God.
So this is in Cockfighter Journal. And so I was like, well, I need to interview Ed Begley and find out if this is real. So anyway, Ed Begley would not do an interview. I tried for years to get him to interview me or to be interviewed. And his agent eventually was just like, he just says he doesn't remember anything. He doesn't remember anything about that movie. But he also had an autobiography coming out very soon from, it was like 7 years, I think I tried to get this interview. And then eventually Ed Begley's autobiography comes out, and he mentions in his autobiography this story of finding this dead body in his garbage. And it was a woman who had been mutilated and stuffed in his garbage. But he doesn't say anything about having to go onto the set of Cockfighter right after or anything like that, So there was hardly anything about Cockfighter in the book, The only thing he says about it is that, he did the movie because Harry Dean Stanton was in it, and and Harry Dean was a friend of his, and so they did the movie, and he just talked about being in the bar after the day would wrap, how him and Harry Dean would drink in the bar. So that was kind of his only memory of Cockfighter, but it did corroborate that story of the dead body, and I was able to then go into the news and find news evidence of that story, of who that woman was and stuff.
For our listeners who perhaps haven't seen the film, I'll just give a quick, and also, I read your book and I thought it was fantastic. I agree with your friend, absolutely. What it reminded me of, your book, was it reminded me of an approach to writing about film which I love and I aspire to, which is to sort of give it a sort of granular, almost novelistic detail. So and you can see how an idea idea has a sort of evolution from a writer. Yeah, I mean, you talk about the short story that then goes into the novel, and then the novel goes into the film. Bits of the novel are left out, as you've already said, and then you go into the process of making the film, and then the afterlife and everything. And then there are all these things, of course, around the making of the film, and the characters, the actors, the people involved. So I think that's so. So just to give a very quick synopsis of the film, this is a movie, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Kayla, or maybe you prefer to do it yourself. Actually, what am I trying to do it for when I have the person who wrote the book right in front of me?
Well, Cockfighter, for people in the UK who might not know, because the film was not released there, is a film about a professional cockfighter. So Warren Oates plays a character named Frank Mansfield, who at the beginning of the story has just lost all of his money, or he basically lost his prize chicken in a fight, but right before a decisive tournament. So it's kind of like an unofficial fight that he has in a hotel room. He loses his prize chicken, is not able to compete in this decisive tournament, and he decides that he is not going to speak until he can win the Cockfighter of the Year award. And the Cockfighter of the Year award is not given out every year, so he does not know how long he's not going to be able to speak for, but he's just not going to talk. And so when we get into the novel, and the film, both, it's been like 2 years that he has not spoken. And so it basically goes through him having to sort of rebuild his stable of prize fighting chickens, teaming up with another guy who's like a former Madison Avenue ad man, who's given up everything to get into cockfighting. And then you meet all the colorful characters along the way as he goes through the southern cockfighting circuit, getting basically getting all the little prizes that build up to the invitation to go back to this tournament to hopefully win the Cockfighter of the Year award. And so for a lot of people, they read a synopsis like that, they're like, why would I watch that movie? Like, why would I watch a movie about a cockfighter? Like everybody, I mean, cockfighting is pretty much, I don't want to say universally because it is actually a multi-million-dollar sport, but it is largely considered a barbaric sport and shunned by people, And this is something that Roger Corman found out when he made the film, because he thought because the sport makes all this money, it must be really popular, and so if he makes a movie about it, this movie's going to make loads of money. But what he didn't realize is that all that money that cockfighting makes is a secret that people really don't like. They don't like visibility around cockfighting, So people did not show up in droves to see the film. Corman famously said it was the only film he made that ever lost money, which is not 100% true, but it became a big part of the mythology around this film. But it was basically considered a failure by everybody who worked on it, pretty much, except for Nestor Almendros, who was the cinematographer. So Nestor actually really liked the film, and he thought someday this movie is going to find its audience, and he was really proud of the work that he did on the film. Even though, according to many other people on set, he was blind as a bat.
He's a cinematographer to Days of Heaven and Francois Truffaut, so he's an absolutely amazing cinematographer. But yeah, as you say, blind as a bat.
Yeah, which is hilarious, right? Because there's obviously a way that he has to work around that as a cinematographer. To work around his sight problems.
I think I heard somewhere that he used to take still photographs of and then blow them up and look at them through a magnifying glass. But whatever he did, it worked.
But he was one of the only people that liked the film, right? So whenever I was interviewing people, you got a lot of people who the only kind thing they had to say about the film was they liked working with Warren Oates. Warren Oates was the first person signed on to the movie, and that was a big reason why anyone else did the movie, is because they wanted to work with Warren Oates. A lot of people didn't like Monty Hellman, who worked on the film. They found him very aloof, and also he had at this point married Laurie Bird, who was the star of Two Lane Blacktop. So he had now split up from his wife, remarried Laurie Bird, which I think was a secret. I don't know if people knew he was married, but he actually had married her. I've seen the documents. But and they were in their little bubble. They were in
Mm,
kind of a bubble together on set, where she's kind of in his ear with her ideas and whatever. And so there was a lot of everybody else on set was like, oh, those two in
mm,
their little bubble. And, there wasn't a lot of interaction between Monty and the other actors, with the exception of Warren Oates, with whom he had a longer relationship. But even then, from the few recollections I got from people, Monty and Warren were not especially close, like on this film, like they weren't palling around or anything.
mm,
And there was just, yeah, a lot of people had bad memories about it. Both casting agents who went on to do like other, much bigger things later, neither of them would talk to me about the movie at all. They were just like, and they literally were like, literally the worst movie I ever worked on.
mm,
The end.
mm.
Don't ask me any more questions. So it was kind of like, so that book ended up being, it was interesting because it became again, like House of Psychotic Women, a book very much about my obsession with the movie. And so the way that I read, so it's got all the production history, it's got whatever I could get, but it is filtered again through, I was like, well, if nobody else cares about this movie, I care about it. So I'm going to write about why I care about it and what it makes me think of and the connections that I make when I'm seeing this. And so I had all the chapters about silence, like the idea of him not speaking for 2 years. There's a whole chapter that's just about the sort of philosophical ideas around silence. And then there's also a chapter all about like Southern honor codes, and the kind of world, the antiquated world that this Southern cockfighting tradition comes out of, and these ideas of Southern honor and Southern blood sports and stuff like this. So there actually was tons of research that was done into this book it was a very different process from House of Psychotic Women, which was much more coming from just my observations. Like a lot of it was just my observations about films and how I connected them to my life. The bibliography of House of Psychotic Women is quite small. I didn't
Mm,
consult a lot of other books when I was writing it. And then Cockfighter was very different, where I was really wanting to do an archival project where I was actually relying a lot more on an archive that existed, on previous writings that existed, and I was in conversation with those things, like I really wanted to do a project like that. And so Cockfighter to me is a better book because it's kind of got both. It's
mm.
kind of got a lot of the personal stuff that House of Psychotic Women has. It does have that personal obsession angle to it, but it also has like all this research and it has, like archival documents and stuff. So to me, it's a superior book. It's just about a movie that a lot of people don't care about, unfortunately.
But isn't that sort of the paradoxical thing in a way which rhymes with the movie? Because the movie is about men who are obsessed with this thing which is a very small world and outsiders don't understand them.
Yeah.
Me and you have seen this film and we can see value in it, and but I feel apologetic about it to other people, when it's not a film I would necessarily, I think you say this in the book as well, it's not a film you necessarily recommend to other people because, if you're squeamish about this or if you're morally offended by this, then yeah, you're, I've not really got many arguments against that. But I was also thinking as I was reading your book, there's a new film by Albert Serra called, well, new, I think it's been out for a couple of years, called Afternoons of Solitude, which is all about bullfighting, and it's
Which
a
I love.
it's
I love that one.
amazing. It's an amazing. Well, yeah, that doesn't
Yeah.
surprise me. An amazing film about a sort of.
But it was again like I was that when I saw that movie and I was like, it doesn't have a physical media distributor, right? So I was
Mm,
just like, maybe I could distribute that movie. But then I thought, who's gonna buy that movie?
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
I could distribute it. I can make a beautiful Blu-ray edition of that movie, but it's gonna have the same problem where, a huge portion of the audience is not gonna want to own that movie, even if they're curious about it and they want to see it out of curiosity. How many people are gonna want to own a movie that has that much animal violence in it?
yeah,
So, but
yeah.
it is a beautiful movie. And I was thinking a lot, obviously, about Cockfighter when I saw that movie.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's that thing of like, look, I was a vegetarian for many years. I'm totally against animal cruelty. I wouldn't personally go to a bullfight, But as they're still happening in the world, I don't see any point in pretending they don't happen by not showing them on screen.
Yeah, but also it was just like the Matador was such an amazing character, you know?
Yeah. Just
And that's the same thing with it's just the same thing with Frank Mansfield. A big part of Cockfighter for me, the interest was in that character and that character's code of honor, that character's vow of silence. Like though that's what drew me to this Cockfighter initially. It wasn't because the film was full of chickens fighting. It was that character, you know. And the Matador in Afternoons of Solitude, you just get this sense of this like, sense of faith and belief and just, I mean, he's on another plane from other people in the movie, you know. He's got this kind of force field around him, you know. I mean, even as other people are dressing him, right? He's
yes.
standing there and other people are literally picking him up to put his pants on because they're so tight, and they're dressing him like a doll or something, you know, and he's just like perfectly zen, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's amazing.
after one of the fights, they put him into like he goes into people carrier sort of van with his entourage, and they're all kind of giving him the pep talk. They're all like, "Oh, where did they get those bulls from? You know, they should be sued, criminal to put bulls in like that." And he's just sort of looking out the window and totally zoned out because he's exhausted, and it's kind of like it's almost it's the same with Cockfighter. It's like the interest is the obsession rather than the object of the obsession. It really doesn't matter what the object of the
Yeah,
obsession is, except that it's a kind of taboo. You know, it's kind of
yeah.
there's a cost to buying into it. You can't, you know, not everybody's going to like it or even understand it.
That's one of the things I talked a lot to Charles Wilford's wife, Betsy Wilford, and that was one of the things that she, I guess, liked about me was that there was a real openness about the sport, you know, and
Mm,
Charles Wilford was not a fan per se of cockfighting, but he could recognize the craft, he could recognize the skill of the people, he could recognize their character. And so he was open to it existing, you know, he was not against it. And I was very much the same in kind of how I dealt with it. I was not against it. I mean, I am against it in the sense that I'm glad that it's outlawed, you know,
mm.
but I also got an understanding of why people do it and what they get out of it. I understood that, you know, and I think that Betsy Wilford, that was one of the things that I think, led her to help me so much with the book was that it wasn't just a purely judgmental book where I was like finger wagging at the sport. I was just letting the sport exist because it exists, you know,
Mm.
and just talking about the sport kind of matter of factly, like this is how it works, this is what people do, this is what people believe is the meaning behind it, you know. So yeah, so it ended up, I actually love the fact that I ended up getting kind of a relationship with Betsy Wilford out of that project too, because she was also over the moon about the book when I sent it to her. She was just like, oh my God, Charles would have loved this book. You know,
Oh,
she's
that's
like, he
excellent.
would have been so proud of this. And she actually even sent me one of the like on the Cockfighter journal, this like limited edition diary he made. There's like a woodcut illustration on the front of the book, and she sent me another illustration that was obviously a. It wasn't the exact one that's on the cover, but it was obviously a test for the cover. You know, so it was like the same artist, and it was like him doing the designs for that cover, and it was like an alternate version of the drawing. And she sent it the original to me, and gave it to me.
Oh, that's
Um,
wonderful.
yeah, so that was amazing.
That's wonderful in sort of having those connections and having you know also retrieving the work of people who you know time moves on and you know unless we're gonna I mean that's another question I wanted to ask you actually you talking there about wondering if you could distribute or sort of do the physical copy version of Afternoons of Solitude. How did you get into distribution? Because I've got a few of my authors who I've interviewed, such as Don't Look Now, and David Hughes has now got he's distributing DVDs and books. How did you get into that? How do you make that step?
Well, I was working as a film programmer, and then I think I used to edit the trailers and stuff I used to have a little micro cinema. And so I used to have to edit trailers for things we played. And so I had a very sort of rudimentary editing skills. And David Gregory at Severin Films was always looking for new editors because at Severin, there's not a lot of money and we burn through editors really fast. They're just sort of like really enthusiastic at first, and then they get tired of how much work it is for such low money and they quit. And so we are often replacing editors. So anyway, he was kind of in between editors, and he was just like, I looked at some of the extras, and back then, like, they've gotten more complex. They were originally a bit simpler, and I was just sort of like, oh, well, I could do that. I mean, if it's just showing clips from the movie cut in between the interview, I could do that. And he was like, okay, great. So he hired me as an editor. So I had just a freelance position as an editor. And it just kind of started there. You know, there's a lot of mobility for people who work at Severin in terms of like which is the same, I think, in a lot of low budget companies, you know, like you just kind of, people work cheaply and you get a chance to kind of see what they're good at. And then you can kind of move them around to some place where their skills are more suited, you know. And at some point, I think David had asked me he actually hated overseeing the editors because if he didn't like the edit they did, he had a hard time giving constructive feedback. And so he asked me if I would look at this other piece that one of the other editors had done. So I gave that person a whole bunch of feedback. And then David was like, oh, that was so much better. He's like, I feel so much more relaxed about this whole process because you did that instead of me. So from now on, you're in charge of that. So the editors report to you and you can give feedback. You know? And then it kind of went from that so I was editing stuff myself. I was working with other editors to give feedback and stuff. And then he was working on a new Blu-ray of Blood on Satan's Claw. And I had nothing to do with this Blu-ray. I was not working on it or anything. But we were just out for beers, and I said, why don't you he said something about how they were just getting all the extras from the British edition because there had been a UK edition that had just come out, and so they were licensing all those extras, and they were just going to basically reprint the same disc. And I said, oh, you're not going to do anything new at all? And he's like, well, what is there new to do? They've already got interviews with everybody. They've already got interviews with critics and whatever cast and crew is surviving. There's nothing else we can do. And I was like, oh, well, you could make a thing about folk horror. Like, you could just make an extra about what folk horror is. And David was like, what's folk horror? Never heard of that. And I was like, oh, well, it's like blah, blah, blah. And he was just like, great, you do it. And I was like, what do you mean do it? And he was just like, well, you know, go tell me how much you think it'll cost and you can make it. And that was what became my film, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror. So I made this 3-hour documentary that was supposed to be a 30-minute extra for Blood on Satan's Claw. But that was my first time producing an extra myself. And that's what happened, is it just blew up into this huge thing. And I'm much more, I understand how extras work a lot more now. So I can actually make shorter extras. But that was literally my first one, you know, so I just I was like, but there's so much good stuff. I can't cut all this out, you know. And, but anyway, so I started doing extras, and then from Woodlands Dark, I ended up producing more, you know. So then I started being in charge of an entire disc where he would give me the movie and I would produce all the extras. I would do the packaging. And then I would have to submit a finished product. And from that, then I got a job doing acquisitions where not only was I doing that, but now I could pick the movie. So now I could just independently go out, look at movies and be like, I want to restore this movie. And then I would spearhead the restoration. I'm not actually restoring the film myself because those are skills I do not have, but I would be the person behind the restoration. And then I would still do all that other stuff, producing all the extras, doing the packaging. And so then it was really from that I kept looking at films and being like, oh, I would love to acquire this film for Severin, but it's just really not a Severin movie. And I was very cognizant of, what brands mean to people, and how if you dilute it too much, you'll kind of lose that core audience that's like, well, now I don't know what your label does anymore. So even though my boss, David, was fine with me picking up whatever weird movies for Severin, I was sort of cognizant of like, yeah, but I don't want to be the one blamed for Severin jumping the shark or whatever. Like
Mhm.
I feel like Severin's good at certain things. Let's keep Severin genre. And then anything that I want to pick up that's maybe a smaller movie that's not a genre film, I can kind of do that on my label. And my label is I made a distribution deal with Severin. So basically it's still getting distributed by Severin. It's going through them, through all of their channels and stuff. So the outreach for the films is exactly the same as if it would be on Severin. It's just that the branding is Spectacular Optical, which is my label, which means that if you're on my label, your movie is not associated with something like The Sinful Dwarf, you know, because there's a lot of filmmakers who surprisingly, when I would contact them and I'd be like, I love your movie, I want to release your movie, and the company I work for is called Severin, and they go on the Severin website to see, well, what's Severin all about? And they'd be like, like, I don't want my movie on that label. Because surprisingly, a number of horror filmmakers do not consider their films to be horror films, right? They think my film is like this elevated art film that's not
Yeah.
horror, and it should be on Criterion. So people are quite snobby. And so, anyway, Spectacular Optical to me was a way to do smaller movies also, that didn't have as much commercial potential. So, my very first movie is a movie about a standing stone. It is literally a standing stone. There's no people in the film. It is just a standing stone in a field for a year. And I was like, I love this movie. Nobody's going to release this movie. So maybe they'll work with me cheaply. And so I contacted them and they said yes. And so far it's been really rewarding. We've done all kinds of fun stuff. And then I acquired some other movies. So I'm doing right now a restoration of an Australian movie called Pure Shit, which is like a day in the life of Melbourne junkies who are trying to find drugs. And that I lived in Australia for a couple of years, and that movie was like really well known over there, but it had
Mhm.
never been released really anywhere else. So I was like, well, I'll do a restoration of that, and I'll do the first North American release of that movie. And so yeah, so I sort of decided on like types of films or modes or feelings of the types of films that I would release on my own label, which were things that were sort of experimental genre films, so that were genre only if it was kind of too experimental for Severin.
Right.
Um, so I got a movie from the BFI called Herostratus, so I'm going to be releasing that because that has genre elements, but it's probably a bit too experimental for I mean, it could probably get away with being on Severin, but it seemed more suited to my label. And so I'm doing music films, counterculture films,
Mm.
landscape and design films, stuff that as a film programmer, when I used to program films, things that I loved programming,
Yeah.
that either just haven't come out or whatever. And I know that you've done some authors that are with Sticking Place
Yes.
books.
Yes.
Have you talked to, do you know Paul Cronin, who runs?
Yes, I know Paul. Yeah, I know him very well.
So my career has intersected with Paul's
Right.
for decades. I've never met him. I have no idea like how old he is. I don't know if he's my age or older than me or anything. But it was like in 2006, maybe, he was one of the people behind this new touring retrospective of Peter Whitehead films. And that was sort of how I first connected with him. Was I was a film programmer and I was like, oh my God, I want to play these films. So we became like one of the few theaters that played this retrospective of films. And basically that was a turning point for me where I was kind of like, in terms of publishing, distribution, all these things, like whatever these films would be called, that's it. That's what I want to distribute. Where it's
Right.
that intersection, you've got visual arts, music, counterculture, like all of those things that are in his films, where it's like all these people from different art forms that are sort of collaborating somehow, activists, whatever. And they're all in the films together, and he's kind of documenting all this alchemical stuff that's happening. And I was like, spectacular optical, that's kind of what I'm aiming for, is I want people to look at it and see my catalog as being kind of like that, where there's all these magical ingredients coming together and making this interesting catalog that wouldn't exist anywhere else. I've only put out one movie though so far, so nobody can see that yet.
Yeah, but I've talked to someone. I was working on something. Well, I am working on something at the moment, and somebody used that movie as a reference. They said, "Oh, you have to watch this. That's similar to
Which
what you're
movie?
trying to do. The Standing Stone in a Field."
Really?
Yeah, yeah. Someone said that as a reference, so I'm gonna have to watch that and see how close it is to what I'm doing. I'll tell you.
Okay.
I'll tell you later what I'm doing, so you can tell
Okay.
me if that sounds like a good reference point. But from reading about it on your website, I was like, yeah, this is pretty good. This is pretty interesting. Absolutely brilliant to talk to you, Kayla, and wonderful. I really hope people go out and order their copies of Cockfighter. You don't even necessarily have to see the film to enjoy the book, I don't think. So it might even be one of those films that it's quite good to go into via the book, which, as we've already said, there's no right or wrong order to do these things. We read lots of books before we saw the films when we were young.
Yeah.
So that's a way in. Final question though, a recommended film book.
Yeah, I mean, I have like, it's hard for me to pick just one.
Well, you can have
There were
several.
some books. Okay, there were some books that were these kinds of books that I would find in used bookstores. There's like one is called Savage Cinema. I'm trying to remember if it was Baxter Phillips that made this book. No, Savage Cinema by Rick Trader Whitcomb,
Mhm.
and Cut the Unseen Cinema by Baxter Phillips. Both of these books were things that I found that were in like used bookstores. I don't know when these books are from. I think they're from the 70s or maybe the early 80s, but they were chock full of pictures. Like this was again kind of like when I was a kid and you're just seeing all these pictures, and that's how you're hearing about the films. And it was sort of, because there were just all these, and they're all about violence in cinema, right? So there's just all this like violent imagery or sexual imagery or whatever in these books. And they just became almost like shopping lists for me to try to find all the movies in these books. Um, but then other things I would mention right around the same time as my book came out, I think they were actually released the same week or very close to each other, was Walter Chaw had a book about Miracle Mile. It was just
Mm.
a book all about the movie Miracle Mile, and it was structured like my book. So it was like my book, but about one movie. And it was like this very, very personal book about his journey with this movie Miracle Mile that he loved, which I also love, and that's
Mm.
why I bought the book originally. But he tells this just heartbreaking personal stories and all this kind of stuff. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh my God, like people are going to think I ripped off my idea of my book from this book. Um, and I later met and became friends with Walter, and he, I think, had a similar experience with my book because they came out like right at the same time. But that's a book I would recommend to people. I mean, especially if you are a fan of the movie Miracle Mile, which is such a great, unique film. Um, Walter Chaw's book about
I spoke to Walter about his book on Walter Hill as well, and that was a great conversation and a
Okay,
wonderful book.
Lee Gambin, the dearly departed Lee Gambin. He wrote and edited many books, but I really love this book that he did called We Can Be Who We Are, which is about 1970s musicals. So it's kind of like this era of musicals where you're getting out of the sort of 60s big showpiece musicals, and you're getting into these kind of grittier musicals that are sort of blurring the lines between, the kind of musical where people burst out singing in the middle of a scene, and something like Fame, where they're performing because it's part of the story that they're performing. So, I mean, that's a great book because it focuses on this period of musicals that don't really get documented in that cohesive a format anywhere else. But yeah, so that book is called We Can Be Who We Are. That's all about musicals. And then newer books, I've just been reading this book by Peter Stanfield called Dirty Real. I don't know if you've heard of this book.
No, I haven't.
It's called Dirty Real. The tagline is something like Hollywood's gin mill cowboys, and it's all about things like, I mean, if I had it when I was writing my Cockfighter book, it probably would have been a reference, because It's talking all about like Chris Christopherson and Dennis Hopper and all these kind of like guys from the new Hollywood that sort of rebranded themselves. Well, Chris Christopherson is a real country guy, so I'm not saying he rebranded himself, but there was like a bunch of Hollywood guys that kind of rebranded themselves as like rural country boys in the early 70s, and like this style of films that they were into and the music they were into became very country focused.
Peter Fonda, would he be in that?
Yeah, so that's a book that I'm reading now, and it's covering, so it's covering that period, but it was interesting because the thesis of the book it was sort of like, I thought it would be much more negative than it is based on the cover synopsis. I thought it was going to be like Dennis Hopper's a poser. I thought that was going to be kind of the thesis of the book. And it's much kinder than that. But I did think that was funny because I do think that about Dennis Hopper. But anyway, so I really like that book. And then also Jimmy McDonough had this amazing book that came out 2 years ago about the Ormond family called The Exotic Ones. And it's this giant book that Fab Press put out about this religious filmmaking family that started off making exploitation pictures. And then they had like a near-death experience where their plane crashed. And they vowed that they would only they'll dedicate their service to God, and they started making religious pictures, but they're basically exploitation filmmakers making religious pictures. So you get amazing. All of this like inappropriate material and just violent films and stuff, so it's a really cool story. And he's like one of the great biographers of music and film. He also wrote that great Andy Milligan biography. So if you have never had Jimmy McDonough on your show, you should have him, because he also wrote a book about Russ Meyer. He's done tons of stuff. He just has a brand new book that came out of a country musician named Gary Stewart that's like everybody is raving about right now. But he's like a really, really solid researcher and a really great writer. So.
Excellent. Oh my God, you've given me a list there. I've been writing them down as you've been talking, so I've got a fair few. God damn it. I keep wanting to finish this show. I keep thinking, right, I've done almost 300 episodes now. I'm almost done. I'm going to run out of guests, right? And then
But you're doing important work.
This is it.
You're doing important work documenting this stuff, because as we said at the beginning, there aren't a lot of people that are documenting this work, right? So you have like the people writing the books who are documenting the work of these filmmakers, but nobody's documenting that work, that process that they're going through, except you. So thank you.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. And it's been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Kier-La. And
well, have a good day. I'm very jealous that you're in Venice. I went there to go. Part of why I bought that Don't Look Now book is because I'm a big fan of Don't Look Now, and I went there looking for all the locations back in like 2012. All my photographs were lost, so I have no evidence that I made that trip. But it was a magical experience being there. I loved it.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.